So Russia does have allies. They just appear to be sitting this one out. But before we get into that, it doesn't look like Americans are very interested in the war in Ukraine at all. I had a video I was starting to put together to complain, to say, man, so many people are interested in talking about the war in Ukraine. Where were we when we had troops in Afghanistan and Iraq? I don't remember the same level of debate, the same level of interest at the national level. But turns out I'm just living in my own little bubble. And I don't know if some of you are there with me, but I'm following people, listening to people, reading articles that are keeping up with the war in Ukraine. So that tends to be top of mind for me. But when I started digging in to come up with some data points to say, look how important the war in Ukraine is compared to how we viewed the war in Afghanistan when we still had troops in country dying. And it turns out Ukraine isn't listed anywhere, like on the top issues that voters are looking at when it comes to the 2024 election. So I've got one poll here: strengthening the economy is top, then reducing healthcare costs, defending against terrorism. Maybe you could have looped that in with, overseas contingency operations, Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria now over the years. But the closest I can find on this list from the Pew Research Center is down towards the bottom. We've got strengthening the military at 40. I guess you could kind of tie that in with the war in Ukraine as a stretch. I mean, it's a major global event going on right now, and it will play a role in the coming presidential election. I just don't think it's going to be the deciding factor, not by a long shot, in terms of who people vote for and who gets elected. The Pew Research Center also put out a poll saying that the share of Republicans who say that the U.S. gives too much aid to Ukraine has steadily increased since March. And that's true, looking at the numbers they have here, steadily increasing amongst Republicans from 9 to 17 to 32 to 40%, saying too much is going to Ukraine. But the same poll shows that number has gone up from 5 to 8, 11 to 15 among Democratic voters, and overall from 7 to 26% among all voters. Of course, people have strong opinions here, and just dive into the comment section, you'll see people that come out strongly on either side of support for Ukraine. But what does it mean if that topic isn't a top 10, even 15 issue for voters leading into the next election? I can see this playing out in a bunch of different directions. Essentially, the idea that we, the American public, are so focused on other items leading into and during the next election cycle that it would be easy for the U.S. government to do anything with aid to Ukraine. They could ramp it up, they could keep it as is, or even start to taper it off without too much pushback from the general public. So overall, it's just not that important of an issue for your average, everyday American voter, for better or for worse, wherever you fall on this topic. But it's really nothing new. Historically, the leading issues in elections have been domestic rather than foreign affairs, wars, anything like that. And that was even the case when we had troops in harm's way in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I guess it makes sense that it's a similar priority, or lack of priority, maybe is a better way to put it, when we're talking about the war in Ukraine. But stepping back from kind of that micro domestic viewpoint of the war, looking at the big picture and how allies have influenced this conflict so far, it's very, very one-sided. So Ukraine has had countries all around the world step up to provide economic, humanitarian, and military aid, so lethal munitions, military equipment, and so on. Not the case with Russia. Now, I understand there's an argument to be made that any country that continues to transact with Russia is Russia's ally in supporting their war effort. China, India, Turkey, and quite a few others continuing to buy Russian oil is showing that they're a Russian ally. To me, and I'm not an economist, that comes across more like they're not shutting the door versus an overt display supporting their military effort. Now, one thing to consider when comparing the military aid between these two countries is that Russia's military is and continues to be much, much larger than Ukraine's in terms of tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces, ammunition, aircraft, all of that. So for Ukraine's allies to get Ukraine up to some level of parity in certain portions of the battlefield, that requires a lot more aid coming to Ukraine than going to Russia. I bring that up because I can hear people saying that Russia doesn't need military aid. They've got everything they could possibly need and more stacked up in warehouses from the Cold War: tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery, rocket launchers, ammo, and they're continuing to produce their own every day. My argument there would be that Russia was pretty quick to acquire and use the Shahed 136 drones from Iran, and there's been a lot of talk over the last couple of months of a decrease in artillery rounds being used and artillery rounds available to the Russian troops and the Wagner troops across the eastern and southern fronts. So I got to think that if one of Russia's allies were to offer up drones, missiles, or artillery rounds, they would take them and pretty quickly put them into use. But the reason that isn't happening is because Russia's allies are hesitant to make that offer. And to get into that, I'm going to talk about 5 different countries: Belarus, Syria, China, North Korea, and Iran. So Belarus, or Lukashenko more specifically, likely has the desire to want to help Russia, and they have to some degree. There's been tanks and ammunition reportedly moved out of Belarus to Russia to be used in Ukraine, but at the end of the day, it's a very small military, heavily dependent upon Russia. It's really going to have the most impact as it is today, being a staging and training ground, that actually sending what they have remaining in their arsenal to Russia to be used. Syria is another pretty close Russian ally, and I wouldn't be surprised if Assad wants to help Putin any way he can militarily. It's just probably not on the table right now. They've got their own civil war. There's fighting all over the country. Any military equipment that they have is going to be used domestically before it gets shipped over to Russia. Now, China's the most interesting one, and they've really walked the line since this war began. They're still very close with Russia, but they've not, at least to my knowledge, provided any sort of direct military assistance that would be used in Ukraine. The primary argument there is economic, that China doesn't want to risk sanctions with the United States and the rest of Europe for getting closer to the Russian war effort. Personally, I think China's involvement or lack of involvement over the next couple of months or even years is going to be a big indicator of kind of where the world is headed. If you think about it, the United States, NATO, and other countries around the world are providing, weapons that kill Russian soldiers to Ukraine. And when rumors started circulating that China was going to do the same for Russia, all these countries, the United States included, said, you better not. As of the middle of March 2023, it looks like the economic ties between the United States and China are strong enough that the U.S. feels confident kind of drawing that line in the sand, but we'll see how or if that changes at all going forward. Now, North Korea is already kind of like sanctioned as could be, so they wouldn't be overly concerned about their economy falling off a cliff if the United States were to sanction them over assisting Russia in this war. There have been some reports over the last few months of North Korea sending, especially artillery rounds, to the Wagner group in Russia. But publicly, North Korea continues to say they're not providing any manpower or any equipment to Putin during this war. The argument there is that North Korea is prioritizing their regional security over any sort of strategic partnership with Russia. It's not that sending a handful of military equipment would necessarily weaken North Korea militarily, but that it would reduce the likelihood of any sort of positive negotiations with South Korea, Japan, or the United States. Finally, you've got Iran, who has been providing lethal munitions to Russia in the form of these kamikaze drones, loitering munitions, the Shahed 136, that have been used in strikes all across Ukraine. So why is Iran acting different than Russia's other allies? And there's a few arguments there. One is that Iran wants to essentially showcase some of their new military equipment, what they developed in-house, as a sort of deterrent against anyone who is thinking about conducting a strike against Iran. Iran is already pretty heavily sanctioned, and this move of providing arms to Russia might be their way of showing that they don't expect any sort of return to a nuclear deal anytime soon. And if that's the case, Iran is probably on the lookout for Israel or the United States to carry out some sort of strike to prevent them from acquiring a nuclear weapon, which, according to some reports, could very well be in the next few weeks or months. And with that potential near-term threat, Iran very well might be using this as an opportunity to acquire Russian air defense systems and aircraft that otherwise might be off the table. I do have to bring up that there's been some speculation, very, very little, that Russia could be helping Iran develop nuclear weapons in exchange for this military equipment that they're using in Ukraine. I don't think that's the case, but I wouldn't be surprised in the next few weeks or months that that headline is thrown out there as a possibility. Winston Churchill famously said that the only thing worse than having allies is not having allies, or something along those lines. But I think it's on full display during the war in Ukraine. And it's easy to look past the fact, with all the infighting and arguments and debates amongst NATO, that alliance has come together to ship an astonishing amount of financial, humanitarian, and military aid to Ukraine, which is crazy. And I think big picture, over the next couple of years, this will probably serve as a unifying event for the alliance that could make it stronger than ever. But that's all I got for now. I'll see y'all next time.